Hey everybody, so we are in the middle video now. We are in the history of cognitive psychology. We're going to be tackling three events that led to the rise of cognitive psychology. Some people call it the cognitive revolution, which is the book calls it that. That's a little much. It's a little histrionic, a little melodramatic. It wasn't like a revolution, like there was bloodshed or anything like that, but it was a big kind of paradigm shift. Let's look at where that paradigm shift came from. The first piece that we're going to be talking about is directly related to what we talked about in the last video, a growing dissatisfaction with behaviorism. There's a good chance that whenever we were talking about what behaviorism stood for, that some of you may not have been completely on board with it. Basically, remember John Watson is saying that if you can't directly observe something, then it didn't really have a place in science, in the science of psychology, in the science of behavior. Would you argue that emotions are not important to scientifically study, or that awareness or consciousness or motivation, that these things are not worthy of study or shouldn't be included? We can't see those things directly, we can't directly measure them, and yet we know they're important, we know they impact our behavior, and that was one of the things that was starting to kind of bubble up under the surface of a lot of psychological literature and research, is that if we want to be a hard science, yes, we do need to focus on direct measurements, and direct behaviors that we can see and we can observe, but that's not the whole story. That's not all of it. And scientists had problems with this, but also the public had problems with this. The public at large was starting to feel like behaviorism was a little too stodgy, was a little bit too rigid, was a little bit too inhumane, cold, calculating, and things like that, too clinical. And so you see this in a lot of literature or a lot of fiction, a lot of books, a lot of novels written at the time that kind of cast psychology in a bad light. A Clockwork Orange is a very famous movie that Clockwork Orange is based on, where you've probably seen clips of it before, where like this guy's he's strapped to a chair and he's got his eyelids pried open and he's forced to watch these violent images. That whole book is a response to Watson and Skinner's versions of behaviorism. So Clockwork Orange, 1984, deals with conditioning of behavior a lot in a very negative light. Brave New World, very similar to 1984, these dystopian science fiction novels that were super popular, that got movies and all this other stuff, reflected how the public was starting to feel about psychology. At first, people thought, psychology is all is concerned about sex and things like that because of Freud, and then it became, it's very cold and clinical and robotic and inhumane, and we needed something else. All right. So the first event here is going to be this growing dissatisfaction with behaviorism, and that might be best represented in B.F. Skinner's dealings with a particular critic that he had. B.F. Skinner ignoring the wrong critic. So John Watson, he was the figurehead of psychology for lots of reasons that are super interesting. He fell from grace, he lost his standing in psychology. He had an affair with his graduate student. He was being very vocal about his criticisms of people who asked him questions, and was getting #problematic. And so another person came and took his place, basically. This guy named B.F. Skinner, you may have heard of him, was voted the most influential, most popular experimental psychologist of the 20th century. And yes, that list includes Freud. So he beat out Freud, he beat out Piaget, he beat out every single psychologist you've ever heard of. B.F. Skinner is probably, I'm biased because I have a behaviorist background, but B.F. Skinner probably probably like the most important psychologist maybe ever. Completely changed and refined the way that we do research, and the way that we talk about research, and the way that we deal with behaviors and all this other stuff. But anyways, so he became the big figurehead for psychology. And One of the things that never quite settled with people who objected to behaviorism was the way that behaviorism talked about and explained language and language acquisition. So, if you think about like classical conditioning and operant conditioning, can you use those principles to develop something as complicated as language? So, you think about your language, you think about children that are learning to speak. Do you think that they are learning that through positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement and positive punishment, or through unconditioned stimuli and conditioned responses and things like that? You might be able to come up with explanations to do that. P.F. Skinner certainly did, but there's a lot of things that still kind of rub people the wrong way. For example, if you look across every single culture, every single one across the entire planet, all of them use spoken language. And not only do they all use spoken language, but they all have certain patterns of syntax. They all use semantics. They all use phonology. These are things that we're going to talk about in chapter 10, I believe. Yeah, chapter 10. We talk about language. But that was something that a lot of people were having trouble explaining. If every single culture has the same basic building blocks to language, and they're arguing that all this stuff was created through conditioning, that means that every single culture needed to have the same kind of conditioning and the same kind of learning strategies, which we know doesn't happen. Anyways, long story. But a lot of people who were non-behaviorists thought that this was really hard to explain. And so to address this, B.F. Skinner wrote a book called Verbal Behavior. This is a book that a lot of people are divided on. Some people in our department, Dr. Reyes and Dr. Andrade, they love this book. I think it's a super interesting book, but a lot of people felt like that this book did not live up to B.F. Skinner's standards, which is surprising because B.F. Skinner thought it was his magnum opus. He thought it was like the best thing that he had written. And so what happens is he writes this book, he publishes it, and then the most popular linguist in the 20th century, Noam Chomsky, who you've probably heard of before, you've probably heard that name, Noam Chomsky, before, probably now today because he's kind of an anarchist political figure who worked or works, I don't know if he's actually still alive, at MIT. And so he says lots of controversial things that gets him in the news and things like that. But before all of that, back in the 60s, he was a world leader in explaining and theorizing languages. So Noam Chomsky wrote a brutal review of verbal behavior. It got published in a magazine. Everyone read it, even the public. That's not really something we would think about today, right? That like the public typically don't really read what scientists have to say about other scientists, right? It's just not in the public eye anymore. But people were like, "Oh, I can't believe Noam Chomsky took B.F. Skinner down. What's B.F. Skinner going to do?" And so people waited to see what B.F. Skinner was going to say. Is he going to defend his book against these really scathing critiques that Noam Chomsky wrote and published, for everyone to read? And so days go by, weeks go by, and Skinner doesn't say anything publicly about it. Months go by, and he still doesn't say anything public about it. And eventually, people just realize, oh, I guess B.F. Skinner's just not going to try to defend his book. And so people kind of interpreted that as, oh, I guess he conceded the argument. I guess that he, lost the debate, so to speak. But the truth is that B.F. Skinner just didn't really take the review seriously. He thought that Noam Chomsky was off base and didn't really kind of read the book appropriately or didn't understand B.F. Skinner's point, and so he ignored it. But the problem is, he lost the court of public opinion. That essentially the way that people viewed this is that the most influential, important psychologist of the 20th century was stumped. That he was unable to successfully defend verbal behavior and how languages are created and how languages are maintained and used and acquired by human beings. Yeah, so that's the first piece here. Looking back, people generally say that this is actually a really good book, that it's that Noam Chomsky kind of was wrong in some of his critiques about verbal behavior, at this point it didn't matter. Like, people had already assumed that it was incorrect, or that B.F. Skinner had conceded the argument. All right, so the second piece, the second event here is going to be the information age. So the information age, really what we're going to be talking about here is the rise of technology. And this is kind of a two-prong idea. One is that the rise of technology, the rise of computing specifically, is going to change the way that we conceptualize behavior, but it's also going to give us new tools to study behavior as well. So John Stuart Mill, who was an empiricist philosopher way back in the day, an English guy, I think in the 1800s, he came up with an idea called tabula rasa. You may have heard this phrase before, especially if you have worked with children. Tabula rasa is the idea that human beings are born a blank slate. That's what it means. Tabula rasa is the translation from Latin, meaning blank slate. And the way this kind of viewpoint goes is that when people are born, they're completely blank, which means that they don't have any bad habits, they don't have any good habits, they don't have any personality, they don't have any pre-existing knowledge, that when they're born, they're completely blank, that they can become whatever they want to be, right? And that it's with experience, as we get older, as we live more life, we start picking up habits, we start picking up knowledge, we start picking up personality traits and things like that. So behaviorists were really big into tabula rasa. A lot of behaviorists believed this idea. Where's my mouse at? There we go. That who we are is a product of our environment and what we've learned and things like that. So this was a useful way to conceptualize behavior, that basically behavior was a blank slate. And what happened is that with the rise of computers, now a new metaphor was going to be used to conceptualize behavior. No longer was it just a blank slate, it was something more akin to a computing machine. And so again, this is, the late 50s. This is just as the first basic, computers are really starting to become widespread. So with the invention of computers, psychologists were able to start thinking about how our behavior is very similar to a machine. So you can think about it not like we're just a blank slate, but that we are a machine that has three separate phases that we handle the world in. So these three separate phases are input, processing, and output. And these are phases that come to us from the computer world. So that input is going to be when we take in information. Processing is going to be whenever we I don't know how to put this in a vague, abstract way. Processing is when we maintain that information, we handle it in some way, maybe we calculate something, maybe we pay attention to something, maybe we remember something, maybe we react to something. That all of these things are after we have seen, heard, or felt some kind of stimulus. We've taken in the information, we're processing it in some way, and then we have the output, which is the resulting behavior of that computation, of that processing. So you can think about this just like a computer, that our computer has an input, has a keyboard, has a mouse, has a touchscreen. Whenever you activate the keyboard or the touchscreen, something happens under the hood, something happens in that computer, something happens in that microchip or whatever, excuse me, and then the output occurs. Then we get some kind of response. Maybe if you type something, maybe the words come up. If you tap something on your mobile device, maybe it opens up an app. All of that is going to be the output. That is the resulting behavior from the previous steps there. And so for thinking about this in terms of like human behavior, you can think about this like input would be if you let's say that you're in a classroom and someone says your name. The input is going to be your name. You're taking it in. The processing is going to be whatever attentional mechanisms are working that are going to allow you to hear and perceive your name. And then the output is going to be what happens, which is probably going to be that you turn to look to see where that voice came from. So basically, you're conceiving it the same flow, same workflow as a computer. And this wasn't just specific to psychology, that whenever the digital age arrived, that information theory affected every single science. It affected chemistry, it affected biology, it affected physics. If you don't believe me, think about genetics. Whenever people talk about genetics, they talk about what? They talk about genetic information, right? That's essentially what's going on here. That quote-unquote information is just this kind of abstract way of talking about whatever's going on in the brain at the time. All right. So the third piece here is going to be George Miller's magic numbers. This is a landmark study that a guy named George Miller gave as kind of a lecture. It's been published, so it has been his remarks have been written down and published, and is so widespread and known and cited all the time. Basically, he gave this lecture where he said this, and I'm going to read it verbatim because I think it's really interesting. So this is how he starts. So imagine you go to this conference to hear about research, and this guy gets up on the stage and he starts with this. My problem is that I have been persecuted by an integer. For 7 years, this number has followed me around, has intruded in my most private data, and has assaulted me from the pages of our most public journals. This number assumes a variety of disguises, being sometimes a little larger and sometimes a little smaller than usual, but never changing so much as to be unrecognizable. The persistence with which this number plagues me is far more than a random accident. There is, to quote a famous senator, a design behind it. Some pattern governing its appearances. Either there really is something unusual about the number, or else I am suffering from delusions of persecution. So if you hear that, I feel like if I heard that, I would be totally on board. I would be like, where the hell is this guy going, right? So you can find this online. It's free to download if you're interested in it. I used to assign this to my classes, but it's like 40 pages long, and it's written in a very obtuse way, and so I'm not going to make you read it, but I think it's interesting to kind of pick up and skim through and look at. But this paper is called The Magical Number 7 Plus or Minus 2. And essentially in this paper, what George Miller is doing is he's arguing that human short-term memory has a limit. And that this limit is about 7 objects, that we can store about 7 objects in our memory at a time. If we try to do more than that, we're only going to be able to hold on to 7 of those things. If we try to remember less than that, then we're pretty good. It's just that we have this limitation at about 7 objects. If we need more than remembering 7 objects, so like for example, your social security number is more than 7 numbers. Your phone number is more than 7 numbers. But you'll note that the way that we remember these phone numbers is by chunking them together, so that you would not just say, my phone number is 912-334-1280. You would say, my number is 912-334-1280, right? And in that way, you're only really remembering 4 things instead of 7 things. So that's George Miller's argument, is that we just have this limitation that we can't read, or we can't memorize more than 10 numbers at a time. So he presented this finding, and the way that he did that was by looking at lots of other people's prior research and then bundling it up and presenting it. And basically he was saying, hey, all these findings that you found, you were wrong, dude. This is actually what was going on. There's a limitation here. It wasn't this other explanation that you gave us. There's actually a limitation to human memory. All right. So why is this study important? Because essentially what George Miller is doing here is he is saying there is something that we can't see in our mind that is limiting us, that is kind of a threshold, and that we can find ways of testing that threshold. by looking at data the way that he looked at it, by looking at this and saying like, oh, it looks like people can't remember more than 7 items, or 7 plus or minus 2, which means for some people it's more like 5 items, and for other people it's more like 9 items. And so behaviorists were not super interested in doing that. They didn't really feel like that was warranted, because for them, that magical number is inside the mind somewhere. You can't directly see it. It is, as behaviorists will refer to it, as the black box. It is this part of the mind that we don't have direct access to. So behaviorists thought that this was something that was beyond our science that we can't study, but cognitive psychology's view is essentially that we can find ways to measure this stuff. We can measure it indirectly, and if we measure it indirectly, and if we're careful about it, and if we're systematic about it, that we can learn a lot about how our mind works. So these are the 3 big events that led to the creation of cognitive psychology. You got the rise of computing, so the way that technology and information has changed the way that we conceptualize behavior. We got George Miller's paper, which is about the limitations of human memory. So it got a lot of people really interested in these internal research questions. And then we also have this growing dissatisfaction with behaviorism, which was that negative public and scientific response to Skinner's book about language. So this is sometimes, as I mentioned, called the cognitive revolution. And really what that signals is that scientists were starting to shift from asking behaviorist type questions, which were primarily interested in responding in operant conditioning and in classical conditioning, to looking at things like what we're going to talk about this semester, like emotions and consciousness and language and decision making and concept formation and memory and attention and all these different things. So people started researching those things now. Alright, so I'm going to check in with you in the next video, where we're going to talk about and finish this chapter by talking about what kinds of questions cognitive psychology is interested in exploring.